Martha just reminded me that November 6th, we will be out here in the lobby for our annual pre-Christmas shop-a-thon with all of our merchandise, books. The new Christmas ornament will be available. Hours are what, 10 until 4?
9:30 to 4.
9:30 to 4. So stop on by and say hey and shop. So now we have Jerry Lynn, and I specifically asked her to do this program because I have only heard bits and pieces of Concord. I've been there, it's fantastic, I love it, and I can't wait to hear the story about the house and the families that have lived there. So, we all know Jerry Lynn, it's yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much again. I am old, and I'm fine with being old, but they've changed the technology on me up here, so if I get confused, just be patient. This doesn't work like I'm used to having things work. One of the great things about doing this particular program is that I hope you all will have some questions, and Rick is the one who answers questions. So think about it as we're going through and save up your questions, and we'll just route them to him at the end. This is Aquia Creek, and this is looking down at Aquia Creek from what used to be a part of Concord. Concord was a very early piece of property in Stafford County. It was acquired in 1665 by a man named Henry Waller. And we had an architectural historian come out, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, and we took her out there to see this, and she was just awed, and she said, how did they get this? Because the property has extensive waterfront on navigable water. It has land that is down at water level for having landings. So the real estate adage of location, location, location certainly applies to Concord, and the people who were able to obtain property like that early on were the first comers into an area, and they would grab property that they saw as having some economic value. So the significance of this piece of property, Aquia Creek had about 7 miles of navigable water between the town of Aquia, which was up in what's now Aquia Harbor subdivision, and the Potomac River. So you could do a lot of stuff on 7 miles of waterway. Now, one of the major activities that went on in that stretch was freestone or sandstone quarrying, and we've talked about that with programs here a number of times. But the freestone quarrying was a major industry on Aquia Creek beginning in the 1660s. They were selling that stone for architectural use in various areas. So the freestone deposits I have covered. Proximity to the town of Aquia. There were 2 shipping points, major shipping points, and we'll call them international shipping points on Aquia Creek in the 17th, 18th, and into the early 19th centuries. One of those is Cole Landing. If you're not familiar with the location of that, if you have been out to Government Island, you go out there to the Government Island parking lot on Cole Landing Road. And if you didn't turn into the parking lot, if you continued straight ahead until you got to Aquia Creek, that area is called Cole Landing. And there is still a very early sandstone wharf that is out there. It's only visible at very low water now, but it's made of massive blocks of sandstone. And you had ocean-going sailing ships coming in there. They were picking up iron ore being made at Accokeek Furnace, which was located behind what is now Raymond Baptist Church. They were picking up tobacco. They could continue upstream to the town of Aquia, which was on the opposite side of the creek. And there was another large stone wharf there, a major tobacco warehouse, and so tremendous activity going on that creek. Sandy Level was downstream a little ways. It was a part of Concord, but you see the name Sandy Level show up in the early land records in the 1600s. So it is quite an early name. And it is very sandy, and it's very level down there. And there was evidence of an early wharf there. The Wallers that acquired Concord ran a store in the mid-1700s. That could have been at Coal Landing, but they didn't own Coal Landing. My guess is that it was probably at Sandy Level where the ships could come in and go back and forth. And of course, if you have ships coming and going, then you have people on those ships that are wanting to do business with a store. The property also had abundant timber, and it had an opportunity for fishing along Aquia Creek. So it had everything it needed to be a self-sufficient plantation. Come on. Come on. Told you I didn't like technology. There we go. All right, so June 6, 1665, a man by the name of Henry Waller patented about 700 acres on Aquia Creek. You now know as much about Henry Waller as I do. None of the Waller family have a clue who this man was. But all we know is in the court records there is an entry for his taking up and patenting this land. In July of 1669, just a few years later, another Waller came in, a man named William Waller, and Gerard Masters. The genealogists believe that they were probably related, possibly by marriage, but nobody can prove that yet. But Gerard Masters and William Waller took up 800 acres on Hope Run, the house site for what became known as Spring Hill, is where Vestavia Woods subdivision is now. So you have these two properties that were owned by Wallers that were very close. They do not seem to have adjoined, but they were quite close. Those two Waller families intermarried with each other, and they both intermarried with the Allens. You now know almost all that I know about the Allens. They were here, they married Wallers. This is more information than you really want to know, but this is just kind of a quick cheat list on the ownership of the Concord tract. So basically you can see that it stayed in the Waller family until 1859 when it was sold to the MacGregors, as in Rick MacGregor over here, and he still has it. There is a possibility of there being a marriage between the Wallers and the MacGregors in the form of Mitchells. There was a Mitchell family of Maryland. The MacGregors were from Maryland. The Mitchells of Maryland intermarried with both the Wallers and the MacGregors. If that marriage could ever be proved, it would mean that Concord has been in the same family since 1665, which is kind of cool, but we may never be able to find paperwork for that. George Waller was very active with the county militia. People often don't realize, we don't think of militias today, or if we do, we maybe have a slightly negative opinion of militias because sometimes they cause trouble or whatever. But early on in Virginia, county militias were normal. And every able-bodied man was automatically a member of the militia. and there was a structure to it that was ranked just like there would be in any military operation. And Stafford County's militia was the 45th Regiment of Virginia Militia. George Waller worked his way up to colonel of that militia, and he served in the War of 1812 and was just extremely active. One of the things that Rick found when he was doing some work rebuilding the porch at Concord, he found what appears to be a militia button, and it has an eagle on it, and it's different. A friend of his works with artifacts and whatnot. He'd never seen one like it, so we think possibly that George Waller dropped a button or lost a button coming and going off the porch. George Waller ended up with some financial problems. He married a girl named Harriet Alexander from Falmouth, and Harriet's dad was a merchant in Falmouth, and he ended up having financial issues. Basically, he bankrupted. And that was a point in time when your debts or assets followed you to the next generation. So her dad's debts followed her, and George ended up trying to deal with it, and it pretty much bankrupted George. So essentially what happened was that a man named Alan Waller-Morton of Richmond got involved with the property, and we don't have the paperwork, but it looks like most likely Alan Waller-Morton paid off Harriet Alexander Waller's father's debts, and in return he received the Concord tract, but Harriet and George were allowed to live there until they died, which they did. So at that point, then the property came up for sale in 1859, and that was when Rick's family bought it. And you can see here that it continued on down. Rick finally got it over in his name in 1981. Charles and Edward Waller are rather interesting. Their father died, I believe, in the 1720s. And he was a resident of Essex. They had started out, family had started out in Gloucester County, and they show up in the records there. And then they moved up to Essex County and owned property on Hoskins Swamp, which is very close to the present town of Tappahannock. And the father was a cooker. He made barrels. What's interesting is that he not only made barrels, he was also literate, and his children were literate, which was something of an accomplishment. And so they came, Charles and Edward inherited the Aquia Creek property from their dad upon his death. And they stayed down in Essex County for a few years, but they finally started moving up this way, and you can follow them in the records. They're in Essex for a while, and then they show up in the King George records for just a brief period, and then they're in Stafford County. So it looks like they arrived here in the 1730s, maybe early, about 1740 or so. Charles Waller Jr., these are brothers, he ran a lumber business. So he had enslaved workers who were cutting logs into lumber and selling it, and that was an excellent business. He shows up in the Accokeek Business Ledger. If you've ever heard our program on Accokeek Furnace, iron furnace, I mentioned it was right behind what's now Raymond Baptist Church, was a major ironworks. There's a business ledger for that ironworks, the only one that's known to exist, that runs from 1749 to 1760. And Charles is listed in there a number of times selling lumber to the furnace, but he also sold a new flat with oars, mast, and a cable. So it sounds like possibly he was doing a little boat building on the side, which was easy enough to do since he had the lumber. Edward Waller, we know relatively little about other than he was here with his brother Charles, and they brought their mother, Susanna Forrest Waller, here from Essex County, and she's buried at Concord, and her tombstone is very interesting because on it she says, Susanna Waller, the mother of Edward Waller. Now, I don't know what happened to Charles. Charles was older, and could he possibly have been, was maybe she a second wife? Possibly Charles was the son by a previous wife who died, but she didn't say anything about poor old Charles. She just said Susanna Waller, the mother of Edward Waller. Now, Concord was in the middle of the freestone quarries. There are freestone deposits, massive freestone deposits on both sides of Aquia Creek. And on the property that was once the Concord tract, it's been subdivided now through various estate divisions and sales and whatnot. But on what was Concord, there are still 5 surviving quarry pits. So this is one of them. Obviously, there's a steep hill to the right, and if you were to go up that hill and walk away from the hill, you would be pretty close to the Concord house. If you went down the hill, you are pretty close to Aquia Creek. So this is, you find these stone deposits like that. They're typically on the sides of hills where they could get into them and work them. Some of the tombstones that are up there, again, probably more information than you really want, but Susanna Forrest Waller, born circa 1677, died 1747. William Waller Sr. died in 1817, but then you see Ursula and William Jr., and I have asterisks next to those. Notice the death date of 1815. If you are doing genealogy in this area, anywhere in the Northern Neck area, if you start noticing a number of your folks that you're researching dying in the winter of 1814, 1815, there was an epidemic. And it was a really nasty, nasty disease, some sort of an upper respiratory infection. You would be doing fine, and then suddenly you get to feeling that little feeling that you get when you realize you're sick, and your throat would get a little scratchy, and the chances were pretty good that by the end of the day you were going to be dead. So it advanced that rapidly. It was extremely contagious, and it wiped out a whole lot of people in Stafford County and in the Northern Neck. So there were 2 here, Ursula, who was the 3rd wife of William Waller Sr., and their son, William Waller Jr. It also seems to have taken out a slave named Mary Lamb. Many of you are probably familiar. You've heard of Mary Lamb before. She has an absolutely stunningly beautiful tombstone. It is made of Aquia freestone. It's down on the corner of the property, and it's interesting because the old road from Aquia Creek came up the hill from the creek, and it went right past Mary's grave. They did not put Mary somewhere on the back part of the property. They put her right out where everyone coming up by road went past her grave. And it's one of the few slave gravestones in Virginia, inscribed tombstones. So she also died during that epidemic. Now, of course, is there a possibility that she had an aneurysm? Yes, but she died in February, so the chances are that she died with that disease. But what's especially interesting about Mary is that it says she is the wife of William Lamb. So Rick and I spent about 5.5 years putting a book together on the Aquia freestone industry. And as a part of that effort, we spent 4 weeks at National Archives in Washington going through every page of the Washington Commissioner's financial records, minutes, correspondence, all of that. And we discovered William Lamb. Now, there was an oral history that came to the MacGregors from the Wallers when they bought the property in 1859. And the oral history was that Mary Lamb's husband was William Lamb, who was a quarrier, and that he cut this stone for her when she died. So oral history is great. I love oral history, and I use oral history in my writing, but I always like to see if I can find some sort of written documentation to back it up. Well, there it is. We found 3 or 4 receipts up in the Washington Commissioner's records, in the financial records at National Archives, in which William Lamb was paid for freestone. And in those records, it will say whether that stone was being ordered for the President's house, now called the White House, or if it was for the Capitol, or for whatever purpose it was going to be for. But his stone was used for both the White House and the U.S. Capitol. He is the only free black that we found a record of as selling stone to the Washington Commissioners. And how do I know he's a free black when his wife was a slave? The reason I know that is because he was paid for the stone. And this is a receipt down at the bottom right. You'll see William Lamb, his mark. He signed with an X. He was not able to sign his name. So then we come back to Mary Lamb's tombstone that is so beautifully engraved. So the thought is, if he was not able to read and write, he would not have been able to have laid that out and had the words and the dates and so forth. So who knows? Somebody apparently drew it on there for him or did something so he would be able to get that on there, or perhaps somebody else carved it. We simply don't know. But that's just fun to have that oral history and then to be able to back it up with an actual piece of paper. So in 1859, there was a rather odd arrangement with Concord. Nathaniel Mortimer MacGregor of Maryland purchased Concord for his daughter, Mary Eliza MacGregor, who had married her first cousin, MacGregor. There was a lot of that, and there seems to have been a lot in the MacGregor family, and I think maybe that accounts for some of the, maybe.
So is that things you married?
Yes. But what's especially interesting is that Nathaniel did not deed the property to his son-in-law. He put the property in trust so that it did not pass in fee simple, which means outright ownership, until both Mary Eliza and her husband were dead. At that point, it would pass in fee simple to their children. That tells me something. That tells me that Nathaniel did not trust his son-in-law. And there may have been good reason, because what's the date on that picture that you have?
49.
1849. The family has a picture of him. I keep saying him. Was it John Rideout?
Yeah.
Yeah, John Rideout MacGregor. I had problems with John Rideout and John Allard. But he was down in New Orleans. Now, you probably didn't go to New Orleans unless you were going to be doing gambling or some other such activity, and that's just a thought. But the property was put in trust, which meant that if John had angry creditors, they could not sell the house out from under the family. Neither he couldn't sell it, the creditors couldn't claim it, and even Mary Eliza wasn't able to sell it. During the war between the states, we know a little bit about what went on there. One of the especially interesting things is that the MacGregors stayed in residence at the house. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Stafford County during the Civil War, when the Union Army was here for their little 14-month-long visit, more or less, they didn't leave much standing. And probably the only reason that Concord was left standing is that the family did not leave. They continued to occupy it. They did not refugee out. Well then, what is going on with John Rideout? Because he shows up in some of the Confederate records as being in service, but he would only be there for a matter of a few months, and then he would disappear from the records. And he supposedly was in the 30th Infantry and the 47th. They merged at some point, but John Rideout spent quite a bit of time at Concord, and for some reason, the Confederate conscription officers did not come and carry his carcass and put him back into service. So the thought is that he may have been involved with the Confederate Secret Service, which was alive and well in Stafford County at that time, especially in eastern Stafford County. And the little bit that we know about the men who were involved with that was that typically they had family or business connections in Maryland. John Waller-MacGregor had both. They were familiar with the water, with Aquia Creek, the Potomac River. John Rideout was familiar with both. And so is that what was going on? We don't know. He had sense enough not to write anything down because people, especially the ones that had been in Confederate Secret Service, typically did not write anything down. It was called being a traitor. So that's just open for speculation on that, but it's an interesting thing to think about. The family silver still remains in the family. Now, typically when the Union soldiers arrived on your piece of property, they immediately went to work taking cows, chickens, geese, sheep, whatever they wanted or needed. And then they also were noted for raiding houses and taking anything of value, such as silver. What the MacGregors did was they had a separate kitchen, which was very typical, and it had a trap door in the floor, and they put the silver down under the trap door and then put a bunch of filthy baby diapers on top of the trap door. And the soldiers went right on by and they didn't mess with it. The family had one pig left, one small pig, after the soldiers had claimed pretty much everything else they wanted. John Rideout stuffed the pig in the cellar under the house, and of course when the pig went squealing, the soldiers knew that it was under there. But just trying to keep something so that he could feed his family. The soldiers took fence rails and of course the livestock and so forth, and their Lieutenant Muhlenberg, who was a Pennsylvania unit that camped on the farm, wrote them a receipt supposedly to get reimbursed for what his unit had taken in the amount of $3,628. So after the war, the family tried repeatedly to turn this receipt in to get reimbursed. Everyone was extremely poor after the war. And the family was turned down repeatedly because there was a little issue about John Rideout having sold a cart and I think a mule or an ox to the Confederates down at Brook. And somehow, if you were going to get reimbursed for stuff that the Union Army had taken from your property, you were only eligible for reimbursement if you had been a Union supporter. And the fact that he had sold a cart and a mule to the Confederates kind of smacked of not being a Union supporter. So they were never reimbursed for what the soldiers took. This is the earliest photograph of Concord, taken about 1907. Obviously, we don't have the whole building. You've got a little less than half of it. And it's pretty basic, as you can tell. Think of this, though, in terms of being genteel housing when it was built in the 1730s or 1740s. But it's been around for a while by 1907, and like most other places in Stafford, if they were still standing, it struggled and suffered after the war because of the poverty of the family. Concord is especially noted for its early architecture. There are several features on this house that are unique or extremely rare. It's considered Chesapeake architecture, and that was a set of building techniques that developed and were used around Chesapeake Bay in the first half of the 18th century. So I'll show you some of that, but this roof line is very typical. I'm sure you've seen other houses that were very steep roof like this. It has the shed porch roofs on both the front and back. The chimney that you're seeing there is on basically the west side, southwest side, and the lower part of that is made of very large blocks of Aquia freestone, and then the top is brick. So it's 1.5 stories. It originally had 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, with the chimney and fireplace on both ends. Now, one of the features about Concord that if you want to see an architectural historian really, really get excited and start to quiver, you mention the term tilted false plate. So you are looking at a tilted false plate. Basically, what they were doing was, this is the upstairs floor, this is the roof going up, so the floor joists upstairs were notched on the ends, and then a square timber was turned up diamond shape and set down in the notched floor joists, and then the rafters were also notched, and the rafters set on top of the squared timber. That was called a tilted false plate. There is not a single tilted false plate in all of Colonial Williamsburg. They have one piece of a tilted false plate that got pulled out of an unknown building and was recycled. Was it in Bruton Parish Church? Somewhere they needed a spare piece of timber when they were doing something in there, and they just recycled it. But there are only about a half dozen buildings left that are known that have that feature. The other thing that is unique in there are the ribbon floorboards that are just split out. The floorboards in the bottom were in there so that you could store things in there. It gave a little bit of storage space. But those are not sawn, they're ribbon, they're split. So in 1976, this is what Concord looked like. A little bit ratty. It didn't have a real roof. It had some green roofing paper that had been used and worked quite well. The chimney that I showed you in the previous picture is the one on the left. The one on the right, that chimney has been pulled down, rebuilt, and pulled down a couple of times. But in around 1911, about 1911, because your grandfather was a little boy, there was only one firebox in that chimney, and that was down at the bottom, but there was a chimney fire in midwinter. Why the house did not go up like tinder is anybody's guess. But the family was home. They went upstairs and started hacking in the wall upstairs. They managed to get that pulled out. Everybody was throwing snow and anything they could on it, and the men were able to push the chimney away from the building and out into the yard, and they saved the house. Rick forgot to ask his grandfather, what in the world did you do? Because now the whole end of the house was open in midwinter. But obviously they survived, and you said that his grandmother even threw the chamber pot, the contents of the chamber pot, on the fire trying to get it out. When he was redoing the house, some of the timbers and wood in the upstairs was still charred from where that had happened. So obviously they rebuilt the chimney. You'll see another picture of it momentarily. They did not do an especially artistic job. It is not as lovely a chimney as the one on the other end. It's also gone again. He's pulled it down and it has to be rebuilt. If you look at that picture carefully, the chimney was leaning away from the house, so it needed to go. I'm not doing well with this. All right, so there it is again. This is just also 1976. Well, this is the rear of the house. A lot of people think that's the front because that faces Old Concord Road. That's actually the rear. The front of the house overlooked Aquia Creek. You can see that it needed a little bit of tender loving care. There was a lot of activity for the bicentennial, and in Stafford County, the Historical Society got together and they designated a group of houses to be recognized as historic sites. And Concord was one of those, and you can see that it's a rainy day. The last lady to the far left, she's holding an umbrella, is Annie Mancure, as in Annie Mancure Elementary School. But pretty much everybody who was anybody in Stafford County is in that little group. I do apologize for this. All right, so this is another picture. I'm not exactly sure what the date is on this. Any idea?
Sometime in the 80s.
Rick's grandfather, Alaric McGregor, who was, MacGregor, who was sheriff of Stafford for years, this was his version of keeping down the undergrowth. Now the issue with that, because he's having a very fine time, but the issue is that this side of the house, this is the front of the house, it overlooked Aquia Creek, and this side of the house had rather elaborate fallen gardens and formal gardens, and he's running the plow through them. Happily, he did not completely destroy the gardens because we've put the terraces back, and you'll see those in a little while. But this is what folks did, and you can see the house looks a mite rough. So Rick was able to get the property, the house, in his name in 1981. It needed a little bit of repair. So that's the front. They added an extra door that was supposed to be a window. It is now a window, so the door to the far right is no longer there. It's back to a window. But when he got it, he realized that there was a bit of a termite issue. And the sills underneath the house were 11-inch square white oak, 30 feet long. They had been hand-hewn and masterfully chewed by the termites. So he figured that all he really needed to do was replace the sills under that, and then he should be good to go, and he hoped to live in the house. So they are now addressing the eaten sills, and of course what you have to do in order to get the old sills out and put new sills in is to suspend the house on poles and jack it up so you can get under it. So that's their project. Truly. There's a little more of the termite damage. Restoring a house is not for the faint of heart. This is also the front. He's taken the porch off at this point, and the house is has poles under it. It's supporting it while they're doing the work underneath. His grandfather, how old was he at that point?
78, I think.
78. So Rick was very excited about doing this major restoration project, and he knew that the timbers in the house had been hand hewn, so he thought it would be a good idea. He wanted to put it back just as it had been. So his grandfather had hewed timbers, railroad ties, for his grandfather, and still remembered how to do it. So his grandfather taught him how to hew, and here they're hewing a floor joist, but they also did the 11-inch square, 30-foot long white oak sills to go under it, at which point Rick decided that maybe for wood that was going to be in the walls or out of sight, it would get solid. Smart move. I love this picture. These are the pieces to go underneath. And if you look at the one on the far right, it looks like I did that one there, but it worked. But again, the house, he suspended the house, jacked it up, pulled all the rotted material out from underneath, and then they slid these in under it and set the house back down. More termite damage. This is on the rear side of the house, so you can see the lath on the inside with some of the plaster that comes through. That's what holds the plaster and keeps it on the wall. You'll also notice there is no insulation. These houses were not insulated. Also, this is a German-style siding that was put on the house after the chimney fire around 1911. And here they're working on replacing the sill. Again, you can see the house is jacked up, it's suspended from the upstairs, and they're getting it under there. So this is the southwest end. So this is the nice chimney that is still there. And so they're working on it. Now in the meantime, you can see a roof behind on the right side of the house. In the meantime, he had brought down a log, 1790s era log house from Pennsylvania with the idea of putting that next to the old house, putting a room to link the two together because he planned on living in it, and he did not want to put a lot of modernization in the Concord house, the really old one, in the form of plumbing or electricity. So the idea was to bring this log house in, so that's what you're seeing. That has been put up by this time. Now this is a really cool feature because the shed roofs on the front and back of that house were put on some years after the original construction. So they don't seem to have been there originally. When they put the shed roofs on, they simply put those over top of the original shingles. So those are 1730s, 1740s shingles that are under there, and they are still under the shed roofs. When he re-roofed again last year, he exposed those, and you can see them from the inside on the back. He left that section of a room open on the back where you can still look up and see those. But they seem to be pine, and they had wrought nails in them. So here you can see more of those shingles. He's rebuilding the front porch and starting to work to reinforce the roof framing. He initially thought that the termites had just eaten the sills and that was it. But when he started gutting the house, they had gone all the way up to the roof, which termites tend to do. The first time I saw this building, I guess it was George Gordon, told me, you need to go out and see Concord. I did not know him at that point. Waller-MacGregor is working on it. So I drove out there, nobody home, but when I stopped the car, I could look right straight through the house. There was nothing but the timbers left. It was completely gutted, and I could look straight through the house into the yard on the other side. Not for the faint of heart. This is Rick and his dad, and they're repairing the fireplace in the downstairs room. That could be the hall, or generally called a parlor now. So it's coming along. It now has a front porch back. He's starting to put the new shingles on it. You can still see through part of it. This is the other side. Notice that the chimney now on this end has been pulled down, and it still hopefully will get put back. The downstairs floors were also eaten by the termites, and he said when you used to walk in there, they had kept a tenant in the house, kept it rented for a number of years, and he had put down cardboard and sheet metal and anything else he could find to serve as a floor. And Rick said when you went in there, it still kind of went like this when you walked. So they had no option but to replace those floors. When you do this kind of restoration work, you cannot go to the Home Depot. I mean, you can, but you're not going to have an old house when you finish. So you cannot use the wire nails that you would use at home if you wanted to build a bookcase. The lumber that is required in a house like this is not sold at Home Depot or Lowe's. So what they ended up doing, his great uncle had spent many years as a sawyer here in the county. And his uncle built him a sawmill, and they custom cut the lumber for this house from trees that were cut locally, and then used that where needed in the house. The uncle had also done quite a bit of blacksmithing in his lifetime, and so they used, Rick bought a large quantity of the masonry nails, and his uncle put those in the forge and forged the rose heads on the top, or in the case of the flooring, made T-nails, which was the proper nail to go into a colonial era floor. So there's just a lot of work that goes into that is more than going to your local lumber supply dealer to get what you need. Here you can see it's coming along, it's getting new siding. His uncle also made a machine using the base of a Singer sewing machine and a motor, and then he cut and twisted a file and put it on a shaft so it would spin, the purpose of which was to cut the little round bead on the bottom edge of every siding board. So all of that has been cut with that wonderful beading machine. So here's the rear side that is also looking much better. Notice the roof has been replaced on the house now. So it's coming along. He's put his window frames in. This one I like. It's done in the winter. They had taken the brick top down off of the house, but they had that put back up now. The roof is complete on this side. The porch is coming along. You can see the log house in the back. And this is the inside. This is from many of these old houses, if they were the two-room, the hall and chamber, the idea was that the hall was the more public part of the house. So if you as the man of the house needed to discuss business with someone, you would do that in the hall if you didn't have an outside or an extra office somewhere. The chamber is the room that I was standing in when I took this picture. The chamber was more of a private area. So your wife and children might have been in the chamber, probably with the door shut. But it just gave a division of function in the house. You can see the stairs going up on the right, the underside of the stairs, and there's a little storage area in there behind that. This is in the hall looking towards the chamber. The fireplace is behind me here. So it's come a long way from what you were looking at in some of those other pictures. What we discovered recently, just this year in fact, there was another architectural historian that came out and looked at it. And we had always assumed that, we knew that some major work had been done on this house at some point, and Rick assumed that it was probably done in 1859 or so when his family bought it. And the family modernized it for the young couple that was moving in. So for all of the things that they changed in the house that we muttered and grumbled because we really would have preferred that they had left it as the 1730s, 40s era house, they had modernized. Well, the architecture historian who had worked for decades with Colonial Williamsburg came in and looked around and he said, oh no, this is like 1805 or 1810. So the work that we were blaming his family, the modernization, was actually modernization from that 1810 time period. This is the interior stair going to the upstairs. There are 2 rooms upstairs. One had a fireplace, the one on the right. The one on the left did not have a fireplace. That's where the chimney had caught fire and got pushed out. But it seems never to have had a fireplace in it. Whether it was a bedroom or whether it was a storage room, typically called a lumber room, we simply don't know. And there it is. Came a long way from that termite-ridden mess that you saw. That is a labor of love because he started in 1981 and it is still, I won't say it's a daily process, but he's there daily and very often doing something. Last year he finished re-roofing. That actually is the old roof on there. Old roof as in 1990s. I'll come back to this one. Maybe I won't. I guess I won't. I had a picture of him re-roofing, which he did, as I said, it took him about a year and a half. But every one of those shingles, remember the shingles that you saw, the old shingles that were underneath of the shed roof? When you're doing a proper restoration, it's not asphalt shingles from the Home Depot. So the original shingles were, what, like 2.5 to 5 inches wide?
About 3.5 to 5.
3.5 to 5, and they all had, the bottom edge was cut, called fish scale. So every shingle that went on that, both this roof that was put on in the 1990s and then the one that he just finished last year, he had to hand cut to make sure that they were the right size. He copied what was the old ones that were on there, so they were all within that width range, and then he hand cut with a bandsaw every round bottom. That's why it took him a year and a half to put the new roof on. And then from 2011 to 2013, we restored the fallen gardens that his grandfather had worked so hard to plow away. Happily, he had not completely obliterated them. You could still see where they had been. So this one we did not hand dig, but the upper ones and the one that runs along the edge of the house, we dug with a shovel and we sifted every shovel full of dirt, collecting artifacts out of it. The tombstones that you're seeing there are for the Waller family. We know that that is the terrace that has the Waller family cemetery. Someone, probably George Waller would be our guess, ordered some stones for his parents and brother, but he never put them up. For whatever reason, after his death and the property was sold, those stones were left just laying, and the MacGregors didn't know where exactly they went. So some of the family, who remain unnamed at this point, some years back came and got Edward Waller's tombstone. Now, you've seen the house. It was in a fair state of disrepair, and apparently they were concerned that the place would completely collapse, get overgrown, and Edward's stone would be forever lost. And so they removed Edward's stone, and it is now forever lost. We do not know where it went. But we have Ursula's, and we have William Sr., and we have William Jr. So Rick and I put those two back up. The other one is broken and needs to have a frame made to hold it upright. Lord willing, we will get to that. So we don't know that they are exactly where they belong, but they are at least Waller tombstones in the Waller Cemetery. I made a list. The Wallers were there for a long time, and I made a list of the various Wallers that I knew had been born to those generations of family, and my guess is that there are probably between 20 and 30 Wallers buried in that strip there. The slave grave is on the other side of the house, just other side of the house and down a little ways, and then out of the picture on the left is the MacGregor Cemetery. So there are 3 cemeteries on the property. They're really quiet. We never have any trouble out of them at all. And the MacGregor Cemetery is fairly large, and you know that the Scots can be very boisterous, but they just aren't. Okay, hopefully you saved up some questions for Rick.
Rick, when I was out there last, it didn't look like that.
No. In what way are you speaking? Are you saying it didn't look as good or it didn't look as bad?
I'll let you be judge of that. You know when I was there last.
It needs a lot of work right this moment. It's amazing how fast things will go down.
Especially when you're not living there.
Yeah. So, and I let the roof get a little bit too far gone before I re-roofed it, which didn't help. So.
Yeah, he was still working on, obviously, on getting the terraces restored at that point in time, so that's why the raw dirt, but we do now have grass there, which means we have to cut said grass.
How many acres are you all down to now?
4.
4, okay.
Rick, did you end up insulating it?
Yes.
Walls insulated?
Yes. Some of that has been, had to be redone. Again, the roof got to leaking and more than I realized, and I've had to tear up a lot more stuff. Thankfully, most of the stuff that got ruined was not original material. Most of the original material is fine. The original house, most of the original house is still under the A-frame. The core of the house is some of the porches still original components in it, but most of the porches have been rebuilt before. They didn't last, but they protected the old house, the old core of the house. So I'm thinking about 80% of the original core of the house still survives, which is pretty remarkable for an old house that age. I mean, most any of the old houses have been just rebuilt and patched and pieced over the years. Mount Vernon, all of them have all this work. You'd be amazed at what you see when you look at an old house that age and how much has been done to it over the years. But to have 70 or 80% of the core left is pretty good for that type of house. You consider that to be most of the house that's still there and it's always been there. So
You must have had quite an interest in Cedar Hill then also.
yes, all of the have been a lot of stuff work done to it. And that's another old one that's been a lot of stuff done to it. Yes.
Now, you were replacing those, I'm calling them boards, but they weren't boards, underneath the house
The sills.
because the termites had eaten them. So how do you protect it from termites now?
There are chemicals and things you can use now, and there are pesticides that can be used now. Yeah. But I figured it took them 250 years to eat the first seals out, and I put them back exactly how they were, so I figured they'd last me.
With having done such an exact reproduction of all the materials and things, do you all leave documentation behind so a future historian will know that while it looks like the original 1700s materials, these are not necessary?
One of the architectural historians got after us about that and said we should do something like that. But
Well, but you had. because you kept that binder.
Yeah, I did document it pictorially.
Yeah, he has a lot.
I just
of
picture
photos.
somebody coming in and saying, look, I found 1,700 hand-cut nails and things, which.
Yeah, they're not exactly, so if you took them out, you could tell. They weren't
Okay,
exactly.
I was curious.
But they're close.
But yeah, you do try and put it back as carefully as you can and as close to the way it was done as possible, which is always a challenge, because the Hilkers have this issue
Yeah.
too. They have an early house, and so if you're restoring, what exactly are you restoring? Are you restoring it to the first version of the house, which, think of your own house. You have probably added things, moved walls, done things in your house that it's changed the house from the way it was when the contractor turned over the key for it. So it's very possible that with an old house, you can't actually tell what the first iteration was, because things have happened to it through the years, and you may or may not be able to tell when that happened. For example, we were thinking that so much of the modernization in there had happened in the 1850s, when it turns out that someone with a more knowledgeable eye was able to say, oh, no, this is like 1810. So the Hilkers have the same problem with what exactly did their place look like when it was brand new. So sometimes you can't put it back like it was when it was brand new because you don't have that information. So, you kind of pick a time period. A real classic for that is the Montpelier house over in, I believe that's Orange County. But they studied that house for years because there had been so much done to it, and until they started taking it apart and opening up walls and ceilings, it was difficult to tell what had been where, because there had been doors that were no longer doors. They had been closed off. They had put in doors where there hadn't been doors. There were windows where there weren't windows, but there had been windows where there were no longer windows. And so it gets to be a real challenge, and like with Montpelier, it took them years of meetings and sitting around and saying, okay, what is it? Where are we going with this? What are we going to restore it to? Yes, ma'am.
What kind of artifacts did you find when you sifted the dirt?
We had everything from Indian arrowheads and flakes and a small tomahawk all the way up to aluminum pop-top cans. And everything in between. The fallen gardens are not just straight terraces like with many houses. They come out at angles and go different places. And there is one angle up there near the house, actually, that seems to have been where they were butchering hogs. And so they just chucked the teeth and the leavings and whatever down over the edge of the terrace, and they ended up being covered up. So of course we dug out all the hog's teeth and a bunch of bones. And then at some point somebody had replastered the inside of the house, so when they pulled that out, they chucked that over into the same corner of the terrace. And so we were pulling out lath nails and pieces of plaster and hog's teeth.
Is that when you all found the Waller button?
No, I
No,
found
that was-
up by the porch.
Yeah, that
Oh.
was earlier.
Reworking on the foundation.
Okay,
Um,
lucky
there
find.
was a
Some of my cousins are here tonight. Their father, my great uncle, was the one that, without him, I couldn't have done it. Without him and my grandfather and my father, I wouldn't have, but they had knowledge. He had abundant knowledge, and he could do anything. So his three girls are back here. They said, they always thought he wanted a boy, and so he kind of adopted me, but I know he fought a lot of those three girls.
I was going to ask you, Ricky, when I heard you say that, or heard her say that you had an uncle who thing
Great
with the sewing machine motor, because I thought that's what he did.
That's what he
Yes.
did. That's what he did. He built the sawmill and everything.
Yeah.
He actually built 2 sawmills, and the second, the one
He
was.
actually built 3. He built the first
Well, yeah, he built
big
one for
circular saw
himself.
first, and then he built the bandsaws, yeah.
But he had the big circular mill out there, and then they decided they were gonna do a bandsaw mill. He went to a sawmill show somewhere and saw one of these things and just thought, this is really cool. So he came home and he built it and used part of the frame from under a house trailer. He used, was it a lawnmower motor and bicycle chain?
Volkswagen parts, bicycle parts, yeah.
Um,
he used it.
Yes, that's right, anything he could use, yeah.
And he still uses that sawmill.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable, and so he's able to custom cut whatever lumber he needs there.
That's wonderful, I'm glad you're using it.
I'm actually working on it right this moment, but I do still use it, yeah.
Yes, sir.
What's the plan for the barn, for the, log home?
It's to be taken down if it doesn't fall down first. It's getting close to falling down, but we're gonna take it
You
down.
want it to fall the right way, though,
Yes, we want it to fall away.
away from the house.
Yes.
Well, Robin and Henry's son, Patrick, he works with the fire department, and he worries about things collapsing, and that, of course, has been a part of his job. So he got very distressed over that log house because he knew that it was going to fall on us and kill us or somebody. So he actually came out and put props in critical areas, so it hopefully will keep it until it's time for the planned demolition of it.
You got my phone number.
Yes. Yeah, it might be good entertainment.
We could sell tickets.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious about the road system in
Mhm.
Stafford County. I mean, I know the Yankees didn't come down I-95, but, was this a main kind of road?
No, this,
Was this a country, it's still a country, I mean, it's a country road now, or an off-road? What were the main arteries of Stafford?
yeah, arteries are, it's probably a stretch, and if you're going back into, we'll say 1700s, 1800s, so 18th and 19th centuries, the old Concord Road right now was the road, not really a driveway, but it was the road that led back to this farm. So early on, if you're looking at 17th and 18th century in Stafford, your houses were built on navigable water. To the best of their ability, that's where they put them, because people were coming and going not by roads, but by water. So you came up to Concord from Aquia Creek. It sits on a high hill overlooking Aquia Creek and what we now call Government Island. And so when the boats were coming up Aquia Creek, they could see this house up on the hill because trees would have been cut. Then they would get off of the boat, and if they wanted to come up to the house, there was a road that ran up the side of the hill to the house, went past Mary Lamb's grave, hung a left, and came to the house. As far as arteries, quote unquote, there were always roads that ran north and south through the county, but the dirt roads that existed were terribly undependable, and the least little bit of rain, you had mud, and it made them extremely difficult to traverse. So if you could go from point A to point B by water, you did that. Route 1 was not put in there until the 1920s, the early 1920s. So very often, let's say that you were at the courthouse or at Concord, whatever, because that's close, and you decided you wanted to go to Fredericksburg. You did not hop in your buggy and go down Route 1 because it didn't exist. There was a road that ran down there, but if you think about leaving
Stafford Courthouse and going south on Route 1 today, it's very hilly down in there. And so there were roads that kind of ran off and did little jags and would take you there. But the more practical way for you to get from Stafford Courthouse to Fredericksburg was to go out, we used to call it Brook Road, but now they call it Courthouse Road. But you'd go out east, you'd go through Brook, you'd wind your way down to what's now White Oak Road and come back in that way to Fredericksburg. The even up into the 19-teens, 1920s, if you're familiar with Mountain View Road, that shows up on maps as the Richmond to Washington Highway. So you were snaking your way back using Garrisonville Road and Mountain View Road, and working your way down to Falmouth that way, where you would take the ferry or later on the bridge across the Rappahannock River and continue. So the roads, if you look at the Civil War era Gilmer map, it looks like a spider web. There are roads that are going everywhere over that. But it's because if you needed to go from A to B, these two roads may be flooded and you couldn't get through. But this road over here was a little bit higher, and so you could follow that road. So arteries is probably not an adequate term for that. It was just paths that led you through the county, generally following the higher ground. White Oak Road is an ancient, ancient road because it follows the ridge, so it would drain. That was,
Go ahead.
No, that, I was just apologizing. I wasn't expecting a road question, and it was, the road issue just gets so complicated.
That's a good
That was
question.
gonna be my question.
It
too.
was a good question.
All right, I live off Hope Road,
Mm-hmm.
and we are behind the old Spring Hill house.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, was there a roadbed that came down off what would have been between Perkins Lane and Windy Street that crossed that creek that went straight up to Spring Hill?
There seems to have been a ford back there, and I'm trying to remember where I have seen that. I don't know if it's on the Shield map or if it's something else, but there is a flat area there with a solid sandstone base
Yes.
in that run.
Because it comes
There.
straight down, it was in the back of my parents' property, it went straight across the creek, because that's where it was the level
Yeah.
part, and then it went straight up, and it brought you up to the Spring Hill farmhouse.
Right.
Okay.
And the real early roads in the county, and we're going back now 17th century, so as you're getting more houses built along these navigable roads, the Virginia government almost immediately started issuing road laws. So for example, if you owned a grist mill, that means that you had a dam behind which you were impounding water to run your mill. Well, a dam makes a really nice solid path to get across a waterway. So some of the very early road laws were orders to mill owners to keep those dams a certain width. I don't remember if it was 10 feet or 12 feet, but there was a required width, and they had to be kept in good repair because those were part of the official county road system. And Rick talks about it now. Well, you tell him, because
It's still an issue today. If an old mill dam washes out, VDOT only owns the right of way across the top of it. So then you get into who's going to pay to rebuild the dam. Sometimes they abandon it because it's not used enough to worry about it. But it's an issue even to this day.
so you have then these early plantation homes that are being built, and the road laws also included orders for each county to maintain a road leading between the church and a ferry or wharf and the courthouse. So those the counties were required to maintain those. Other roads started being built that connected the various plantation homes, because you might live in this one, but your son lived in this one, and your grandson lived in this one, and your grandson and your son needed to be able to get their tobacco to your wharf to ship it. So you get some of those early roads that were linking these homes, and then from there it kind of branches out over time.
Sure. You got a question from somebody watching on Facebook, and they wanted to know whether or not you all had been able to trace any of the African descendants from any of the people that you all actually knew names of that were on your property.
I so wish we did.
We'd love to know a Lamb descendant, but we haven't found one.
We have Mary Lamb, who died in 1814 or 15. We do not know when William Lamb died. I believe the last payment for stone for him, I think, was 1821. And then there is a census record, which has to be either 1850 or 1860, probably 1850. But there is a Lamb, I believe it's Nancy Lamb on there. But we know nothing about her. I've no idea who she was, if she had children. No one has ever come back. Mary Lamb's grave is fairly well known. There's been quite a bit published about her grave, so I would think that if anyone realized that they were descended from her, that they would have let us know by now.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this the oldest house in Stafford?
We're not really sure. It certainly is one of. The only other one we're aware of that might possibly predate it is Albion, down on the Rappahannock River. We've not been able to get into Albion. There supposedly is a story, I shouldn't call it a story, there's information out there that there is a brick that is inscribed.
Piece of wood or something.
Or a piece of wood, 1723?
1719, I think.
Oh, 1719.
If that's a fact, then it's probably older than Concord, unless Concord's older. But the only way to know for sure would be to have Denver chronology done. We haven't done that, so we may do that. We may do that, just because that's the way of telling. They check the tree rings. But at least one of the oldest. It's only 2 or 3 that are this old. And Hickory Hill is another one. It's supposed to be pretty old. But we don't know the dates exactly.
How do you spell that, Albion?
Yes, Albion. It's down on the Rappahannock.
It's on the Rappahannock River, and they have taken it was a prime piece of real estate that had sand and gravel on it. And the sand and gravel companies have taken away all the sand and gravel around, and left it up on a plateau now, and the cemetery is also up on a plateau. They did the same thing Sandy Level. They took sand and gravel out of there. Fortunately, the house wasn't there, down on that level.
Anything else? You all have been wonderful. Yes, sir.
You said the front of the house is overlooking a Quiet Creek. How far down is the Quiet Creek from there?
Not very far.
No?
You couldn't throw a rock to it. But the view of it, when the trees were cut, you could see all the way down to the Potomac River. But that was the view shed. But the creek itself is just over the hill, not very far to the left of the house.
I didn't realize it was that close.
Yeah, it's right on the hill there, overlooking it.
With the trees, you really can't tell. When people come and we have them out there, we'll say, Quiet Creek is right on the other side of that tree line. But until you walk over there, and like the opening slide that I had, you have no idea how high you are or that creek is just right there.
You could almost throw a rock to the creek if you were throwing it from the side of the house and there weren't any trees in there.
Wow.
Is the creek a marsh or is it free flowing?
It's both. The channel runs right there.
Okay.
That's where the ships came up. The ships would come up all past Concord, go up past Concord up to Quah Harbor, where the old town of Quah was up in there somewhere. And the ships would come all the way up there for the town and bring it back, take it back and bring it in.
It hasn't silted it
Oh,
down?
yes, it's silted in many times. It's been put dredged at least twice.
Okay.
over to Old Concord, down past where the Harmons live, and take you to the railroad tracks and come out at Hope Springs Marina?
No, that road wasn't even there. My grandfather had that road built back in the sixties. He had
All
that,
the way down to the marina?
he had it built between Sandy Level and Cole Landing.
Oh, okay.
Didn't go any further.
Thank you.
But that's a really good question, because we were talking about these early roads, and wherever, oftentimes roads did follow waterways. Now, I just finished telling you that a lot of the roads were up on ridges, which they were. But there were also roads called creekside roads. So there was one that followed Chapawamsig Creek, and it was the Creekside Road. And so it's very typical for some of these early roads to be following Aquia Creek or whatever. On the other side of Aquia Creek, across from Concord, there's an area where there's a road that follows along. It's now part of what Aquia Harbor subdivision
Yeah.
is.
And there was one from Cole Landing, apparently. They went over to the Quiet Town too. It was along the river, or along the run,
Yeah.
Austin Run.
Yes?
I've just got to say, this is fascinating to me. We live in a very old house. It's been there since 1987. But just to hear, you mentioned early on, you were talking about something that is where Vestavia Woods is now.
Mm-hmm.
And we back right up to, we don't live in Vestavia Woods, we live where that ends, and we're there. But right behind us is Hope Creek and, all this other stuff. I used to put my boat in down at the marina, so it's just to hear all this and trying to understand what it was all like, and hearing that, understanding now finally that freestone is sandstone.
Yes.
And as a boy, I lived on a point in the river that was named Freestone, and I saw your pictures with the big rocks, and I said, those rocks were on the cliff on the top of the hill.
You were at Freestone Point in Prince William County.
Yes, ma'am.
Same stone.
Same stone.
Yep. I mean, the picture with, may have been you, I'm not sure who was standing there with the rocks, but standing there in the quarry. And I said, I have seen that exact same thing. We lived right on the beach. My father ran that place for a while back in the 60s. But right on the water, the big hill behind us is where the gun emplacement was for the Civil War. So a little beyond that, you've got boulders just like that, just sitting there.
We wish we'd have known you a few years back. You could have showed us that. We were doing a book.
Oh, we have lots of information for you.
Good, good.
Now, I used to be in a book, and my picture used to be on the new, but at the time were the new rails for the boardwalk that they rebuilt down at Lisa Vania. I was a smiling face on the wall there for a while.
Yeah.
I doubt if I still am.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
Maybe, I know I've done a program about Aquia Creek and the activity on Aquia Creek, but some of you folks probably haven't heard that one. But Aquia Creek was just an astounding place. If you go there today, there are fishing boats and there'd be a pontoon boat and they go back and forth. But we're talking about 7 miles of water that was navigable to international keeled sailing vessels that were coming from Europe and the islands and coming up Aquia Creek on up well into what is now Aquia Harbor subdivision to the little town of Aquia. And this stuff is going on from the 1600s on until the Depression really shut down the sandstone industry on Aquia Creek. But you had the tobacco industry that was going on. You had the Accokeek iron furnace that was in blast from about 1723, 25 up to about 1752. So all of the supplies coming into that operation were being brought in by sailing vessel to coal landing, then being put on carts and carried out to the furnace. All the pig iron that was being made at the furnace was put on carts and was hauled out to coal landing to be shipped either to the company's forges in Maryland or back over to England. And then the stone industry. There's just amazing activity for that stone industry that most of us are familiar with, that going on from about 1792 until around 1840s. And we think about those stone quarries as operating because of the building of Washington, D.C. But if you're familiar with Bacon's Castle in Surrey County, the first roof on that place appears to be Aquia sandstone shingles, according to two PhD geologists that we had that looked at samples. So that building was constructed or finished in 1665. So you had all this stuff going on for a very long period of time that is truly astounding, the level of activity. Karen?
How does that correspond with the activity in Dumfries?
Or
have you connected the two yet?
Dumfries is not my problem.
But it is mine.
But yes.
Or was.
Yes. Dumfries was one of a series of port towns that were established by act of parliament. Some of those go back to 1690s, so you get the town of Marlborough here in what's now Stafford, that was created by act of port. I'll get the date wrong, but say 1689, somewhere in there. And basically, Parliament was concerned about being able to collect all the taxes that they felt they were due on tobacco that was being shipped. So rather than have Joe Plantation owner shipping tobacco out from his own private wharf, which they were doing, which thereby bypassed the collection of taxes for the Crown, they decided we're going to set up official tobacco port towns. Sorry about that. So Falmouth is one of those. Alexandria is much later. It was, it wasn't Alexandria, it was Belhaven. That one was a little bit later, but Dumfries is one of those. There were a whole line of these things from all the way down in southeastern Virginia. Those port towns were ordered in most instances to be built as far upstream on a navigable body of water as a keeled vessel could go at low tide. All right, now that makes sense. But, you know where Amy's Cafe is?
Yeah.
The first wharf in Falmouth was right, if you went out of Amy's door and you turned right and you walked to the Rappahannock River, that's where the first wharf was for the town of Falmouth in the 1720s. Obviously, keeled sailing vessels could not get up there for very long because of silting and whatnot, and this is what happened to Dumfries as well. So for many of these port towns, their lifespan was pretty much over within 50 to 75 years because they had been built so far upstream that the wharves were no longer accessible to sailing vessels. Now, you're probably saying, well, that was a stupid thing to do. Why would you put it so far upstream? Just it made more sense to have moved it further downstream. To us, that makes more sense. But think in terms of either whether they're wagon loads carrying or wagons carrying several hogsheads of tobacco, or if you've got a couple of men who have that hogshead on a pole and they're rolling it to the wharf and to the tobacco warehouse where it's going to be inspected, graded, weighed, and so forth before it's put on the ship. The further you have to haul that stuff, the more damage you're doing to the tobacco. So the point was to get your inspection stations and wharves as close to the inland plantations as you could. So that was the rationale behind that. So obviously, again, I come back to Dumfries, that really is the poster child for siltation, shutting down a port town, because there is no port town there now. And most people are hard pressed to even imagine that it was a port town.
Yet they claim that at a certain time, and I can't give you the date, they did more shipping traffic than New York.
And I've never had reason to try and compare any shipping records. We've never had available shipping records from the town of Falmouth.
Right.
The deal with Falmouth that was different from Dumfries is that Falmouth was the official shipping point for the upper part of the Shenandoah Valley. That stuff was coming, their product was coming out of the valley, coming down more or less what's now Route 17, coming down Washington Street in Falmouth to the warehouses that were there where Amy's Cafe is, and to a lesser extent where Simpson's real estate office is, and then being shipped. And then of course everything coming in, whether they're European store goods or furniture that somebody ordered or a set of wine glasses that somebody ordered out in the Shenandoah Valley, it's all coming into Falmouth and then being hauled by wagon out there. How much shipping happened in Falmouth and in Dumfries, I don't know. But what you do find is that the port towns in Virginia typically were dominated by Scottish storekeepers who doubled as factors / agents for English tobacco companies. And so those English companies owned the ships that were hauling European store goods to Virginia, but were also going into the islands and picking up rum and sugar and all that good stuff. And so you just had this circuit going. And the factors for those shipping companies ran stores in these various towns. So some of the merchants who were keeping stores in Dumfries also had stores in the town of Aquia, also had a store in the town of Falmouth, and sometimes had a store in the town of Colchester. So you've got a network of those Scots merchants there. But again, we have almost no business ledgers. We know they were there, but we don't have enough detail to really put together a very good picture of it. Oh, Martha's telling me I'm done.
We could take tangents off to every 400 years of our history. But thank you so much.
Is this for you? So I didn't get an ornament?
Just go in your basement.
Oh, by Anne Klein.
Yes.
Oh, how sweet. Thank you.
It's such to be early and to give this to your
That is so sweet. Thank you, and I can use the jar to candy.
Thank you for coming, everybody. This was fabulous. Thank you.